Now, when it comes to Georgia, there's very interesting new reporting here from the Washington Post. Quote, one relatively high-ranking Justice Department lawyer, a man named Jeffrey Clark, seemed to entertain Trump's requests, pushing internally to have the Justice Department assert that fraud in the state of Georgia was cause for that state's lawmakers to disregard Georgia's election results and appoint new presidential electors. Trump contemplated installing Jeff Clark as Attorney General. Clark was then running both the Environment and Natural Resources Division and also the Civil Division at the Justice Department. And he, unlike others in the Justice Department, was more sympathetic to Trump's claims of election fraud. According to people familiar with the matter, Jeff Clark became particularly focused on Georgia, trying to persuade Justice Department leaders that they should issue a letter that argued that Georgia's elections were affected by fraud, and as a consequence, Georgia's lawmakers should disregard the presidential election results and instead appoint their own electors, meaning have the Republicans in the state legislature pick Trump electors instead of the state's electors who were for Biden because Biden actually won the state. According to two people familiar with the matter, Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen tried to convince Jeff Clark that his theories were misguided. On New Year's Day, he shared with Jeff Clark the cell phone number of B.J. Pak, who was then the U.S. attorney, the top federal prosecutor in Atlanta. Two people familiar with the matter said that Rosen was helpful, that the U.S. attorney could convince Jeff Clark there was no widespread fraud in Georgia. After giving Jeff Clark, the U.S. attorney's phone number, Rosen circled back the next day, asking Clark in an email, were you able to follow up? In a meeting at the White House 2 days later, January 3rd, according to two people familiar with the matter, President Trump complained that he wanted to fire the Georgia U.S. attorney, B.J. Pak, who he felt was not doing enough to uncover fraud in Georgia. The people said participants in the meeting told the president that B.J. Pak intended to leave anyway, that he need not take the step of firing him. Just after 10 p.m. that night, an email shows a senior Justice Department official named Richard Donahue emailed the U.S. attorney, emailed B.J. Pak, writing in the subject line, please call ASAP. Two people familiar with the matter said the official conveyed to B.J. Pak what was said at the meeting about him. Early the next morning, Pak informed staff he was stepping down. He was then replaced by a new U.S. attorney, a man named Bobby Christine, whom Trump viewed as more amenable to his voter fraud claims. This is the fullest accounting we have yet had of that incident. The president pushing these bogus election fraud claims in Georgia because he does not want to have lost Georgia. He's threatening Georgia officials, right? We now know, telling them they needed to find enough votes to declare him the winner. He's got a guy he's trying to install as the new attorney general, planning to install as the new attorney general, who wants the Justice Department to, in fact, write to Georgia and tell them they can't certify their results. They need their election results were infected with fraud and new electors should be appointed. The U.S. attorney, the top federal prosecutor in Georgia, got calls from Main Justice by that official who wanted to tell Georgia officially from the Justice Department that Georgia needed to uncertify their election and instead say Trump won. The U.S. attorney, after receiving that call and getting a follow-up call from the White House, resigns under circumstances still not clear. There is an active criminal investigation underway in the state of Georgia into the president's actions when he tried to interject himself into the process, tried to influence elections officials to try to get them to alter the election outcome in that state. It's being investigated by multiple congressional committees and by the Justice Department Inspector General. It is also being investigated as a criminal matter by a state prosecutor in the state of Georgia. What was said to that U.S. attorney who resigned? What was said to him by the Justice Department official who called him up, the one we know wanted Georgia to undo its election results? What was said to him in the call from the White House? Why did he resign? What did they try to get him to do? And this is starting to look like a pretty good map of the potential crime scene for an ongoing criminal investigation. Joining us now is Amy Gardner. She's the Washington Post national political reporter. She's one of 4 Post reporters who's bylined on this story today. Ms. Gardner, it's really nice to have you here. Thanks for making time tonight.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
So this piece today is a great sort of connecting of the dots and a bringing together of lots of different sources of information, including interviews with people involved in or briefed on these events. In terms of the pressure that was put on Justice Department officials, what are the unanswered questions here? What are the black boxes that aren't answered either in the emails or in the interviews that you and your colleagues conducted that either a criminal investigation or congressional investigation might be able to get at?
Well, I can tell you what I'm really curious about. I'm certainly curious about exactly what prompted BJ Pak to resign, as you just alluded to. I think that there are a couple of different possibilities, and we just don't know what happened. It seems as if Rich Donahue called him to say that Trump was displeased with him and that conversation prompted Mr. Pak to resign. That doesn't mean that Pak was asked to do something that he didn't want to do. It could mean that he saw this is a man who was planning to resign anyway, had already announced his plans to resign. He saw that he was going to be a distraction in the efforts in Main Justice to sort of fend off President Trump's efforts to overturn the election. So we just don't know exactly what happened there. The other thing that I'm really curious about is you talked about Jeff Clark, the Assistant Attorney General over Environment and Civil, who was more eager than some of the other leadership at DOJ to help President Trump find evidence of fraud. Well, what was the evidence that he was pursuing? And who is he talking to seek out that evidence? There's one exchange in the emails that we got yesterday where he talks about where the acting attorney general, Jeff Rosen, says, "Did you talk to BJ Pak?" And we know from our reporting that he wanted Mr. Pak to explain to Mr. Clark that there wasn't widespread fraud in Georgia, that he should back off, that this was a fool's errand. But instead, Mr. Clark responds to Rosen in this email, "No, I didn't talk to Pak." He says, "I spoke to the source. I'm on with the guy who took the video right now, working on it, more due diligence to do." We have no idea what he's talking about here. What video, what guy? I mean, there were videos shot, as we all know, of election workers and, voting equipment contractors doing their jobs that were wildly misinterpreted by conspiracy theorists. People had death threats. There was a noose hung in the front lawn of one worker for Dominion voting in Georgia. Was he speaking to somebody who took videos like that, who in some cases had, relationships with QAnon? Was a senior leader in the DOJ going to people with QAnon relationships to find evidence of fraud in the 2020 election? I mean, that's my biggest question that I don't know the answer to right now.